On June 4th of this year, the Washington Post penned an article with the headline, "Arizona and the Southwest States Grapple with Water Shortages, Drought." With the understanding that the American Southwest is parched, what are experts in the field doing to combat this issue? And is it true that all states such as Arizona are affected by water shortages? Sarah Porter, the head of the Kyl Center for Water Policy at Arizona State University, explains the ambitious $5 billion proposal by an Israeli company to transport ocean water from the Gulf of California to Arizona through a pipeline. Sarah examines the advantages and disadvantages of this plan, shedding light on the water issues in the Southwest and providing valuable perspective on the matter. Join us as we get rebelliously curious. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me on Rebelliously Curious today. You are the director of Arizona State University's Kyl Center for Water Policy. There have been multiple conversations about if Arizona is going through a water crisis. There's also been solutions that have been put forward on the table, talking about building a plant that would pipeline water from Mexico into Arizona, along with conversations about water policy and sharing water with Mexico. So thank you so much for joining me, and I can't wait to get into this discussion with you.
Happy to be here.
Before we get into it, I would love to know how you decided to get involved into the conversation of water and water policy. I know you went to Harvard, and also your background is an attorney. So I'd love to know how this line of progression within academia, and then also this area of study of water, and how you came to be where you are now.
Well, it feels like a really straight line to me, but I think to other people, it seems like I've veered all over the place. I was practicing law at a law firm in Phoenix, and I grew up in Phoenix. I was born in Phoenix, so it's a place that I love and feel, that I know pretty well. When I was a young mother of young children, let's say, the National Audubon Society, a wildlife organization, habitat protection organization, was opening nature centers, nature education centers that were particularly designed to reach audiences that didn't have access to nature experiences. And it happened that around that time, Audubon had connected up with the city of Phoenix, which was restoring a 5-mile section of the Salt River bed. We used to have a river that flowed through Phoenix, but over time, as it was dammed up upstream, the riverbed became this kind of degraded part of town. And the city of Phoenix and the Army Corps of Engineers made a big investment in restoring it as a riparian habitat. Still doesn't have a flow. But anyhow, I got recruited to the board of the local Audubon, Audubon, Arizona. And I was so passionate about that project. Eventually, they created a position for me. And within a few years, I became the state director. And as state director, we had our nature center built, and I was thinking more and more about what we could do to protect habitat, particularly for birds. And I and other Audubon leaders in the Intermountain West thought that the next big thing we could do would be to work collectively on protecting riparian habitat, or we should say streamside habitat, because in hot, dry places, and even just dry places, wetlands and rivers and streams are the most critical habitat to protect. So as I did that, working on that with people all the way up through the Rockies, essentially the Intermountain West, I got more and more interested in water policy, and could see that while my personal passion was for protecting what is left, protect the riparian habitat that is still intact, make sure that we're saving enough. I also could see that we wouldn't be successful thinking about protecting rivers for wildlife if we weren't also thinking about the water needs that humans have too. And so I got more and more interested in water policy. And when the time came where there was an announcement of a job for the director of a new water policy center for Arizona, I was really excited because I thought this is a great next step for me. And I've been there since 2015.
Yeah. Can you speak to the water crisis right now that's potentially, we've heard mixed things of water
Yeah.
crisis within Arizona, and we'll get to that too. But within the American Southwest, can you speak to that and then what that crisis right now entails from
Yeah.
your
Well,
perspective? Yeah.
I'm even reluctant to characterize what's going on with water as a crisis. We're not at a point where somebody's water isn't going to run tomorrow or next week by any stretch of the imagination. And so first of all, I think it's important to note that every state has different water laws and policies. And so from state to state and certainly city to city, there are marked differences in the water security or water resilience. And the impacts on water shortage differ depending on who the water user is. So there are, is it a agricultural user, or is this a city water department? Big differences. In the big picture, in the Southwest, what we're really grappling with, the main driver of concern is declining flows in the Colorado River. So, the Colorado River, in comparison with other rivers in North America, would not seem like a very major river. But because it's the only thing out here in the American Southwest, it's a really important river. 7 states and Mexico, northern Mexico, Sonora, rely on the Colorado River. 29 Native American tribes. Some 4 to 5 million acres of agriculture are irrigated with water from this river. And of course, it's a place of enormous biodiversity, and it's the river that flows through the Grand Canyon. So this is a river of great, and the cultural significance, the economic significance, we really can't understate it. The way back, a little over 100 years ago, the 7 states that lay claim to water from the Colorado River came up with a compact, and the compact concluded that the Colorado River produces 15 million acre feet of water. So an acre foot is this wonderful volumetric that harkens back to the settling of the American West for farming. And it's basically an acre, it's a foot of water on an acre of land. And I can't even begin to convert to metric, but it's about 326,000 gallons. It's about enough water for 4 fairly efficient single-family homes. So back in 1922, the 7 states and the federal government, which was kind of facilitating this effort to get the states to come to an agreement about how to share the water, they agreed that the river produces at least 15 million acre feet, and they divided that 15 million acre feet between the upper part of the river, the upper basin, and the lower basin. The lower basin is Nevada, Arizona, California, and Mexico. Now, Mexico was added later by treaty. In reality, the river at this point is producing probably maybe 12 million acre feet, something like that. If we just averaged it out over the last few decades, it's far under 15 million acre feet. And so the crisis, if we're going to use that word, is about the fact that there is not as much water in the Colorado River as people had planned on.
Right. And we're seeing these headlines in Arizona saying that there is a drought and there isn't, and there are this water crisis that's happening right now.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I am seeing that mix. So we are from what I'm hearing is saying that there are obviously bringing this to attention because it can get worse if we don't start looking at it now and protecting the land and be able to do something about that.
Yeah.
My ignorance may be potentially in water, but isn't there a reserve though? You have multiple different layers of water collection, let's just say, lack of words, but in the the last part is your reserve. Now, is that the same way based on the Colorado River as well, too, that you'd have these reserved, and once your reserve is used up, then you can't refill the reserve again. You only have the water that's available.
Well,
Is that true in
yeah,
regards to this?
I,
Yeah.
I don't, I mean, I think what you're getting at is probably the case. I look at it a different way. And it is true. The way we see declining flows in the Colorado River is the two big reservoirs that hold water for the lower basin. That's Lake Powell and Lake Mead. They have been persistently declining. The elevations of these two big reservoirs have been persistently declining. And those reservoirs are an important part of the water storage and delivery system. In Arizona, and this is true for Southern California too, we mostly rely on what you might call imported supplies. We don't rely on water that falls to the ground from the sky directly above us, because there just isn't that much precipitation, particularly in Phoenix, in Tucson, for that matter, the Sonoran Desert. So that system, Lake Powell and Lake Mead and other parts of the system, are critical storage for roughly a little less than a third of the supply for the greater Phoenix area. It's a more significant supply for the Tucson area. Phoenix has an in-state river system. I mentioned the Salt River before. A tributary of the Salt, the Verde River, is also part of it. So these two rivers, the Salt and the Verde, provide another roughly third of the water supply for the greater Phoenix area. And then the last other big supply is groundwater. That's water in aquifers. And then there's one more source of supply that is an increasingly important supply, and that is reclaimed water that has been put into the wastewater treatment system and then is treated up to a standard appropriate for reuse. Currently, for cities in the greater Phoenix area, reclaimed water is a very significant supply of water. So right. Anyway, it's the Colorado River system that is the one that is where we're seeing these issues of declining flows. There's not as much water as we expected. The in-state surface water system, the Salt Verde system, is not as susceptible to the impacts that we're seeing on the Colorado system. So it's in really quite good shape. And to me, as somebody who, is a water nerd, a big concern about declines in Colorado River water is that the backup supply for Colorado River water is water from the aquifers. And out here, where we don't get a lot of precipitation, we have to regard groundwater as a non-renewable water supply. When we take it out, it doesn't get replenished unless we have policies in place that require, sustainable management of groundwater. Fortunately for the Phoenix and Tucson areas, we do have such policies in place. But those policies combined with less Colorado River water mean we don't have as much water as we thought. So we have enough water for people who are here, and we have rigorous planning rules and policies to ensure that we have sufficient water over a long term. Our planning timeline is 100 years for the people who are here. But this is one of the fastest growing parts of the country. And so we're really in this discussion about where do we get water for growth?
Right. It's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize that people were still driving towards those areas. I know they are, right, for sure. And I know that they were, and obviously we look at North Carolina, the population's growing. Also, the population's growing in general. You need to put people somewhere. So it makes sense they would be going to those areas. There's a proposal for a company right now that will be investing $5 billion. It's a project led that's from an Israeli company that's looking to bring in piping systems, I believe it is, or just a system that would be able to take water from the ocean. In layman's terms, we say taking water from the ocean and being able to then bring it into those areas that are dry or going through a drought. Can you talk a little bit about that project and then your thoughts around it coming from a water policy perspective?
Yeah, I'm really pretty familiar with the project, as I sought an opportunity to have a briefing from from the company. And so let me start by saying that, ocean desalination is a technology that's very proven, and desalinated ocean water is an important water supply for municipal water users all over, many parts of the world. We think of Israel as kind of the leader in this, but many parts of the Middle East use it. Other parts of the world rely on desalinated ocean water. Every system that I know of for ocean desal produces water at a high price. And so desalinated ocean water is a good water supply for municipal users who, where there can be a huge amount of demand management, where the water that goes into the wastewater treatment system can be reclaimed and reused. But we should be clear that ocean desalination right now is not a solution for agricultural water users. That water is way too expensive to use to grow food and fiber. So there are two concepts for desalinated ocean water becoming part of the water supply for the Phoenix area, greater Phoenix area. A concept that's been out there for many, many years and has actually received sort of government, a sort of authorization to continue to develop it, is not for a pipeline, but rather for Arizona water users to pay for an ocean desal plant that would provide water for water users in Mexico. And then Arizona water users would take in exchange some of Mexico's Colorado River water. So that's one concept that's been out there for a long time. And that concept would not involve a pipeline of any, the kind of significance that you'd have to pipe that water to somewhere to deliver it to water users in Mexico, but it doesn't involve a pipeline from a coastline all the way up to water users in Arizona. So that exchange has, it's pretty far along. There are actually well-developed technical memoranda. This concept was captured in the binational treaty between the United States and Mexico that governs the sharing of Colorado River water. So that's just something that's out there. The pipeline concept is, to my mind, kind of an alternative approach. And that idea is to build an ocean desal plant in the Gulf of California. So, we have Baja and then Mexico. And so the Gulf is created by those parts of Mexico. And the concept is to build a desalination plant and then pump the water north, up through that little bit of Sonora, Mexico, through Oregon Pipe National Monument, all the way up to a place west and slightly north of Phoenix, where the Central Arizona Project Canal runs. The CAP Canal is the canal that moves Colorado River water 320 miles across the state from our western border across and down to Phoenix and Tucson. So the pipeline concept that has been proposed is to run the pipeline up to the canal before it gets to Phoenix and pour that desalinated ocean water into the canal, because the canal is good delivery infrastructure for water users, from Phoenix to Tucson. So that's the concept. Unlike the exchange concept, a potential disadvantage of the pipeline concept is that each country does not control the water supply that it benefits from. The exchange concept has this kind of genius that each country would have control of the water supply from which it benefits. Pipeline is a little more complicated. Also, the pipeline would require a greater energy load to pump the water all the way up from Puerto Penasco, Mexico, all the way up to central Arizona is, a bigger lift than pumping it to water users in Sonora, Mexico.
Right. And I want to go back to the energy comment, because what type of power are they looking to use to run these types of plants?
Yeah. Well, the company that's proposing this project has I mean, it's still super early days, but they've kind of scoped out maximizing the use of solar energy. So there is abundant solar energy. Arizona is a really good place to do solar energy. Solar energy is problematic. It is not a 24/7 supply. So this project potentially could use, as much solar energy as possible when it's being produced, or it could use solar energy plus storage and then, have a 24/7 supply. Those things come at a cost. Solar energy plus storage is a fairly expensive source of power. So that all of those factors and decisions will have a big impact on the cost of that water, to the end user.
Right. And I can see pros and cons in both areas. I'd say cons wise, when we're looking at some type of sharing, we might get stuck into political issues and hopefully not that are around water and policy.
Just
right. Just
really hard to imagine that like the United States might elect a president who would say things that would offend the president of Mexico and water becoming a political football. That is just wildly beyond imagination.
Right.
But that's truly a risk that has to be considered. I mean, all over the world, there are examples of conflict over water resources. And so that's an important consideration.
Right. And we look at countries, China's dealing with a water crisis right now.
Yeah.
I believe they're, using water below their reserve right now, or they're using their reserve, which is a little scary. I don't know where that is, where that's been, or if they've been able to get that back. Hopefully they will, but we do see that. And that's something that I could see for sure having an issue, obviously with Mexico and in the States. And then we look at the other side by building something of a plan and a piping system. We look at massive amounts of disaster when it comes to ecosystems.
Yeah.
So, and potentially Aboriginal land that this is going to be going across. So where do we find solutions? And what would you say might be?
Yeah, I think that one's tough too. Organ Pipe National Monument is a federally reserved national monument because it's a place where this very special cactus grows, the Organ Pipe cactus. And it really is kind of an extraordinary cactus. It throws up all these arms, it's aptly named, I guess. And the pipeline would require a right-of-way. It's something like 170-foot wide, 75-foot wide right-of-way through Organ Pipe National Monument. And that would be, a tough sell, I think. There are also some kind of fundamental issues about the cost of the water and the economies of scale related to the pipeline concept that I think make it a harder concept to actually make happen. I never say never to anything in water. I don't think we can predict with much accuracy, but in reality, cities don't need that much water. Cities are getting pretty efficient. We used to, 100 years ago, when the American West was settled, the government had a policy of trying to put every acre of land under the plow that could be put under the plow. And if you had to dam up a river and move that river somewhere else, you did that because that was the national policy. And we had, I think of it as the era of what was called reclamation. I've never understood why it was called reclamation, but the policy of the nation of the United States was basically these really big disruptive projects, turn a canyon into a reservoir, move a river hundreds of miles to deliver it for use for farming. And that kind of disruptive big project is probably not as necessary to make sure of water for people in cities. Since the mid-50s in Arizona, the population has grown almost 6 times. The economy has grown 21 times. We're using slightly less water as a state than we did in the 1950s. In the last 20 years, the population of the Phoenix to Tucson area has grown 45%. We're using 15% more water. We've decoupled economic and population growth from water demand. And I think that's super encouraging. We're seeing per capita water use declining year after year in most cities, certainly in Arizona cities. So we need to adjust our expectations to the realities of this, our ability to get more and more efficient with our water use.
Right, because one of the proposed solutions would be then selling the water back to the people, and they haven't really estimated a cost and how much that would
be.
Be.
And that's really difficult because it's what I've been told from the pipeline concept folks is that they need to sell 300,000 acre feet of water a year. So they need commitments to buy 300,000 acre feet of water to make this plant pay off. Right now, the city of Phoenix, 100-something-year-old city, it's like a 120-year-old city. It's the 5th largest city in the United States. It delivers 300,000 acre feet of water to taps. How long will it take for a market for 300,000 additional acre feet of water to grow in the context of urban areas that are getting more and more efficient with water use? So, population growth doesn't have that impact on water demand that growth of agricultural areas had 100 years ago. So I think it's challenging to pencil out building a desal plant that has to come online selling 300,000 acre feet of water a year. That's an enormous amount of water. And it's water that's going to be the most expensive water that was ever, acquired in Arizona.
We're looking at, again, the environmental impact. They're saying that brine then will be then put back into the Sea of Cortez. How would that impact then any of the marine, or if you can even say that, would it impact? I would imagine it would, right?
Well,
is that cost outweighed?
Yeah, I mean, to return brine, and there are lots of different methods for returning brine. In other words, once you take all the salt out of the water, you have left over this very, very salty water that needs to be put back in the ocean, the brine. And there are different methods for dispersing brine. The methods that have the lower impacts are likely to be more expensive. I mean, that additionally would add costs. I know that, I'm not a marine biologist, but I have read articles in which marine biologists are expressing concern because the Gulf of California, or Sea of Cortez, as some people call it, is a really special little ecosystem. And so the brine disposal has to be done in a way that's consistent with protecting that habitat. So it's another cost. I am pretty confident that Mexico and Sonora would not allow a desalination plant to be developed that was damaging to that ecosystem. It's a place that is cherished by many people in Mexico and by many people in the US Southwest as well. And so I don't see it as this plant coming in and wrecking the ecosystem. I see this as additional investments that would drive up the cost of that water by the time it was ever reached some water user in Arizona.
Right. Has an environmental review been done on either sides when it comes to obviously not yet? Okay. Is there a reason why it might not have? Is it too early in stages?
Yeah, it's too much in the concept stage at this point. It would need to be further developed before it ever got to the environmental, to a serious environmental assessment stage. So it's really very much at a conceptual stage. And I have to say, this really is largely about economics. At this point, I can name 5 other water augmentation projects that are already underway that may be all that's needed to make sure of abundant, water for all the growth that the Phoenix area can accommodate. So it's before you get to the most expensive project, you have to get through all those less expensive projects. And there are several that are underway that may be all that's needed.
And so do you think this is more of a political play, or, people, something that having both all politicians are able to to speak
No,
about and be
no,
able to, and it's not
I
so much
go,
of a consideration for the people?
well,
Yeah.
I go back to the original concept, which really was cooked up by uh, the way the original concept, the exchange, came into being was, I kind of imagine it was by um, water leaders from the US and Mexico who get together on the Colorado River all the time, probably having drinks or like sitting around and just sort of, tossing around ideas and saying, this potentially could make a lot of sense. It can be scaled appropriately. It doesn't have to be, an enormous amount all at once. It can be gradually brought online, and it has this advantage of each country having control of the water supply from which it benefits. That concept, I think that idea of desalination someday providing a benefit, by the way, not just to Arizona water users, Southern Nevada is also involved in these discussions. Again, the Las Vegas area could be co-investing in a desal plant for people in Sonora, Mexico, and take a small exchange of some of Mexico's Colorado River water for that investment. So this exchange concept made a lot of sense to the longtime people who were involved in managing the Colorado River. The pipeline concept sort of came up as a surprise. In 2022, the state legislature of Arizona created a new fund for financing new water supply projects. And in the quick rollout, it was a time where we remember we had an election. Arizona had a new governor elected, changing parties, but all these big new things, including this new fund for water augmentation. The outgoing governor quickly appointed people to the board of this big new fund. And before they had even hired a director to, manage this, they heard from the Israeli company that's proposing this pipeline concept. It isn't a concept, and that's really like the day that the hearing occurred for the pipeline concept. I was worried that might impair the very careful process that had been ongoing for years regarding the exchange concept. So that's all to say, like this pipeline concept might happen, but it isn't the one that people who've been worrying about water supply in Arizona for 20, 30 years. This is not a concept that has been on their radar. There are other desal concepts that have been on the radar, but this one has not. And this one presents some, the big challenges that we talked about. I think one of the biggest, there's so many challenges, but anyway, there are times when I think about it and think it would be amazing, if you could do it right. Desalinated ocean water can be done in a way that that doesn't have a negative impact on habitat. It could be done with renewable energy. It could be such a big solution. At other times, I think there are so many impediments to make this happen, from the environmental issues that we talked about to the lack of the critical mass of customers that concept needs to become a reality. I don't know when the Phoenix area will have buyers for 300,000 acre feet of water, but I can tell you without any doubt, it is 50 to 100 years from now. We have many other options before that pipeline would make sense, that need to be developed.
Can we talk about those other options too? Because we have this exchange, and then we also have this now pipeline.
Yeah.
What else could be done that would be hopefully environmentally friendly, or even just within the regions?
Yeah.
Within,
Yeah, exactly.
within different
And I
states
think that
they
point,
could. Take this on their own.
you know, within the something that doesn't require a binational treaty is just by its very nature simpler to make happen for the most part. So in Arizona, there are really two kinds of Colorado River water users. There are the water users right along the main stem of the river, and then there are water users in central Arizona who use the water that's brought via our CAP canal, and those are people from the Phoenix to Tucson area. One of the important main stem Colorado River water rights holders is the Colorado River Indian Tribes. That's the name of a tribal community in Western Arizona. They just received federal authorization to, as we always put it, it's kind of funny, but lease some of their Colorado River water to users, other water users. So that's probably the easiest new water supply for central Arizona, is leasing water from a tribe right on the main stem. That water, of course, could be moved via the Central Arizona Project Canal. It just takes, that only takes agreements. I mentioned before our in-state surface water system that's a really important water supply for the greater Phoenix area, the Salt Verde system. The biggest dam on the Salt River, Roosevelt Dam, has the capacity to store a little more water. So this is a matter for it. There's a big amount of space that has to be left empty in a dam like Roosevelt Dam, this dam on the Salt River, in case we have a massive flood event. But the entity that manages the dam, SRP, has done years of study with our United States Bureau of Reclamation and concluded that they could probably store a little more water than they're currently authorized to store. They actually got authorization to pilot a project to store additional water in the Salt River. And so that's another nice, just a nice additional supply of water. When they're not allowed to store that little bit of extra water, that water has to be, as it's called, spilled and allowed to run through the riverbed. While it's really great to see water running in a riverbed that has been deprived of its water, that water can't be put to what's called a beneficial use. It can't be used by, people in cities. So again, that's a project that doesn't require any additional infrastructure. It's simply a matter of federal authorization to store a little bit more water. Those are kind of the lowest hanging fruit. Higher hanging fruit, but not as high as piping desalinated ocean water from Mexico, are enlarging one of the reservoirs on the Verde River, a reservoir called Bartlett Reservoir. The concept, and this is well underway with multiple stakeholders, including the Federal Bureau of Reclamation. The concept is to retire an upstream reservoir and manage that upstream area for habitat. And then the downstream reservoir, Bartlett, could be enlarged and more water would be available for water users in Phoenix. And then on top of that, there are 3 aquifers, 3 subbasins set aside in Arizona law. They've been set aside for 40 years to allow groundwater to be pumped out of those subbasins and transported outside of the subbasin for use. One of those aquifers, the Harquahela, is right next door to Phoenix, to the west. And so a concept that there's no physical development, but there certainly is legal and economic investment in this concept, is to pump out groundwater from the Harquahela Basin and pipe it to western suburbs of Phoenix. So those are really kind of, that's not a super, it's not on the scale of a pipeline from the Sea of Cortez or the Gulf of California. Another project that's underway, I think it's still very much conceptual, is that Los Angeles pours 160,000 or so acre feet of effluent into the Pacific Ocean every year. Phoenix and Las Vegas recycle every drop of water that they can from the wastewater treatment system. But it made sense when Los Angeles was developing its wastewater treatment system decades ago to take that effluent and pour it into the ocean. So the various Colorado River water users are now looking at the possibility of water users in Arizona and in Southern Nevada helping to fund water reuse in the LA area, again, with the idea that those investors would benefit from an exchange of some of California's Colorado River water. So those are some things that are really not as heavy a lift as a pipeline that needs to deliver as much water from day one as the city of Phoenix, is the demand the city of Phoenix developed over 120 years of being a city.
It's so early too. If you have about at least 100 years where you'll have water and you have all these other solutions that are local to you and in your own country, you think you'd start there rather than going towards a larger company and, wrecking the environment, along with then creating relationships that unfortunately politically might be overturned as years go on, and making it harder for people to consume water.
Definitely a risk. I don't think there's much heart by water users to wreck the environment. And certainly the company that's proposing the pipeline, wants to mitigate those impacts, although 175-foot right of way through, Oregon Pike National Monument is a pretty big impact. As might be, a desal plant right on, the Sea of Cortez. So we would need environmental assessments to really understand the scope of those impacts. But I think the bigger thing is we have a choice. We really face a choice. And there are these options for additional water supply. And because those options are easier and because the water from those projects will be less expensive, those are going to happen sooner than a pipeline. But the other thing is that Phoenix has had this pattern of growth outward, as so many Sunbelt cities have, this outward growth. And to some degree, we're at this point where the difficulty of acquiring new water supplies for growth may make development, infill development and higher density development more attractive. So this may be one of a number of factors that we could look back on in 10 or 20 years and say that was when growth began to shift from outward, exurban growth to higher density growth. The bigger, older cities in the greater Phoenix area are essentially in a program where they're proving up that they have 100 years of water available for current and future growth, and they reprove this every 15 years. And for those cities, the solution is grow upward, grow more dense. So when we're talking about these projects like a pipeline, we're talking about providing water to a place that is completely undeveloped at this point, that is, undeveloped Sonoran Desert in the outlying areas of Greater Phoenix.
So why would you not be able to use pipeline water from the sea into Arizona for agricultural use?
We want affordable food, and the cost of food produced with desalinated ocean water, that input of the cost of water would drive up the cost of whatever crops were produced with it. Currently, the city of San Diego is right next door to the Carlsbad desal plant. But that plant, by the way, this is a very substantial ocean desal plant, and owned and built by the company that's proposing the pipeline for the Phoenix area, IDE. They are paying over $3,000 an acre foot for the raw desalinated ocean water that plant produces. Last I checked, it was $3,053 an acre foot. So farmers along the main stem of the Colorado River are probably paying like 15 or 20 bucks an acre foot for water. The farmers, we used to have farmers using subsidized water from the Central Arizona Project, subsidized Colorado River water, and that's a whole backstory there, but they might pay $200 to $300 per acre foot for that water. So the cost per acre foot from a pipeline from bringing water, a couple 100 miles north from Mexico to users in Phoenix is probably going to be substantially more than the cost of water that San Diego pays to the Poseidon plant, in Carlsbad. So I'm thinking $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 an acre foot. That might make sense for urban water users if they are not using much water outside, if almost all the water they use is being used indoors and can be recycled and reclaimed. You can see how that makes sense. It's hard to make that make sense for farming.
Wow. Thank you so much, Sarah. I hope, going to Arizona and spending so much time there, also as being a Canadian and watching what's happening within, the American Southwest, I really do hope that there's solutions that are put forward and looked at way before we start looking at putting in larger plants that are worth $5 billion or to build worth $5 billion. So I'm happy to see that. I'll be following along with the news and with your stories. And I'm happy to see somebody who's interested in policy and interested in hopefully making some change and putting other solutions forward rather than the ones that they have now. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. And I really do appreciate your interest. We love our Canadian snowbirds who spend time. They're a good influence. But I think an important takeaway that I hope I've conveyed is that some of the brightest, most creative, most thoughtful people are working on water, not just in Arizona, but in the American Southwest. And, we say never say never to anything because who would have ever imagined the Roman aqueduct a few hundred years before it was completed? Who would have imagined the Central Arizona Project Canal? Who would have imagined that we could capture water, from air and deliver clean water for households on the Navajo Nation? That's happening. So never say never, but by the same token, all of these concepts need to be carefully considered. And we need to make sure that we can afford it, that the environmental impacts can be mitigated, and that it makes sense for the long term.
That's awesome. Thank you, Sarah. And as I say to all my guests, thank you for being rebelliously curious with me today.
Nice to be with you. Thanks.